So Emmanuel Macron came to the European Parliament here in Strasbourg this morning. He's a passionate pro-EU supporter. He warned us that there seems to be a European civil war going on between liberal democracy and rising authoritarianism. And he thinks those of us that support nation states are the authoritarians. Now, normally, I would have spoken in this debate as a group leader, but I gave way to a guy called Florian Philippot, who's an MEP, who now leads a small French party, which I guess I'm going to call the French UKIP. And this is what he had to say.
In a recent interview to the BBC, you talked about the hypothesis of a referendum of Frexit in France, and the fact that this referendum could actually not succeed. Well, let me put you to the test then. Make sure that French people have their freedom, their choice. I think it's worth more than some kind of getting together with Brussels, getting together with Berlin. After all, our nations are civilizations. We are brilliant civilizations. Will always be much better than any European treaty. So yes, let us leave the European Union. Let us enter into the world. And Mr. President, if this prospect doesn't please you, well, then I suppose you could always move back to the European Commission, perhaps be recruited by Goldman Sachs or something like that. I think you would just be moving up in the echelon. So long live Frexit and long live Free France.
Frexit. Frexit, the F word. I'd never ever heard the F word. I'd never heard Frexit used in the European Parliament, and you may have heard bits of applause there from the people around him. Believe you me, on the other side of the room, there was a lot of booing, and a very angry Macron later on shot back and said, well, if that's how you feel, why are you sitting here at all as an MEP? The kind of thing they used to say to me.
And then you've asked me about Brexit. I'm in favour of the most integrated relations, the closest relations. And there is a solution we're very familiar with, and that's EU membership. It's the situation which allows perfect access to the single market, access to the freedoms, and a very good integration. There are going to be negotiations. Michel Barnier is conducting them under a council mandate, but there's no cherry-picking in the single market. That's a simple principle. I believe in Europe, and therefore I believe in what we've done.
Procedo ora alla chiusura del Procedo ora alla chiusura del Procedo ora alla chiusura del
We have a context of division and indeed doubt within Europe. Brexit continues. It's still being discussed, but there is doubt in a number of European countries. And month after month we're seeing views and sensibilities emerge which call into question certain fundamentals. There seems to be a sort of European civil war. National selfishness and egotism seems to take precedence over what brings us together. There is a fascination with the illiberal. Indeed, in this world and in these difficult times, European democracy is our best chance. The worst possible mistake would be to give up on our model and indeed our identity. This is a democracy that respects the individual, minorities, fundamental rights, which were used to be called liberal democracy, and I would use that term by choice. And there's also the deadly tendency which might lead our continent to the abyss, nationalism, giving up of freedom. And I reject the idea that means that European democracy is condemned to impotence. We're seeing authoritarianism all around us. Let's look at things full on the face. Fewer than 1 out of 2 citizens vote in European elections. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you will have grasped that as I said, the European Parliament is a seat of European sovereignty, of its responsibility, and indeed of Europe being alive. It is on this that we must anchor a Europe based on the spirit of its peoples. And I hope in future months we will overcome north, south, east, west divides, big versus small. We must overcome this inward-looking nationalist selfishness.
Thank you, President Macron. your main asset is really your oratory skills. You are a very good rhetorician, it has to be said. I'm still fascinated by the movement in the elections. You promised everything to everyone. You promised that you would unite the left with the right. You also promised that you would be able to guide the people into the light where everything is beautiful and warm. And then, of course, we were confronted with reality once you were elected. And you've lost a lot of support in France, it has to be said. Your ambition, you have an ambition and I have an ambition too, but my ambition is not to make sure that Brussels or the European Union take power over my country. That's not my vision. My vision is not that we should be sat here in this chamber and take decisions on particular provisions that we could actually resolve much better back in our home countries. That's not my vision. But I believe in my own country. That doesn't mean to say that I don't believe in Europe as such. I believe in a Europe where we're friends with our neighbours, where we have trade agreements between states, where we have a different system to the one that we have today. The Parliament, it's not really a Parliament because there isn't a unique European people to represent, but nevertheless this Assembly meets primarily in Brussels. If you talk about the European religion, then you curry favour. If you talk about other things, not so much so. Now, of course, you've always been very wise in talking about the rich, the wealthy. I mean, they can, of course, get on their own, off their own motion, but who can we please here? Those who perhaps lecture us, those who for so long have confiscated power, those who for so long have turned their back on the people? Well, actually, the jury is here, right here before you in the European Commission. They judge you every day and they will give you a grade. I can assure you straight away your grade will be excellent because your speech basically took up all the canons of the European Catechism. So the jury will give you a good mark when you talk about European sovereignty. Of course, it is a fallacious argument. How else could you possibly undermine national sovereignty unless you go down that road? The Commission will also encourage you with your agenda, the liberalisation and destruction of public services, a total opening of borders, disregarding the risk of migration, disregarding the risk of terrorism, and of course any kind of trade protection is seen as something irrational according to you. Now, today, for once, you spoke in French, which was perhaps not customary for you. Very often, when you speak in public, you choose to leave behind the language of Molière, the French language, and you speak the language of the Americans. But nevertheless, I'm sure you will still carry favour with the Commission because you're such a good pupil, you're such a good student, you're happy to follow the policies of the lobbies and the Commission. You're a bit like Matteo Renzi or Tony Blair. You're very much, a favourite in Brussels. And you talk about reforming the European Union. You're already failing in that regard. You're already disappointing us because the EU is not reformable by way of its structure, and therefore you have failed when it comes to glyphosates, when it comes to the secondment of workers, and that's why I'm afraid I'm sad. I'm sad. France is an old nation, and leading that nation is a noble function. I don't think that this is the right way to go about it, just parading yourself as the top pupil of the class. President of the Republic, please do not fall for the lobbies, for the technocrats. The world here is actually the old world already. What about the world of tomorrow, the world of people who will hold their heads up high once again? I think you need to move with history, be on the right side of history. The British peoples have already decided to break free, break their chains. Yes, the British people, whether you like it or not, sovereignly voted in favour of independence and freedom. Freedom and the future of the European Union. Well, the European Union is the past. Therefore, President of the Republic, I urge you to talk about France and talk about France as a free country like President Chirac did in 2003. He was strong enough to stand up to the United States and say no to them. In a recent interview to the BBC, you talked about the hypothesis of a referendum of Frexit in France and the fact that this referendum could actually not succeed. Well, let me put you to the test then. Make sure that French people have their freedom, their choice. I think it's worth more than some kind of getting together with Brussels, getting together with Berlin. After all, our nations are civilizations. We are brilliant civilizations. We'll always be much, much better than any European treaty. So yes, let us leave the European Union. Let us enter into the world. And, Mr. President, if this prospect doesn't please you, well, then I suppose you could always move back to the European Commission, perhaps be recruited by Goldman Sachs or something like that. I think you would just be moving up in the echelon. So long live Frexit and long live Free France.
But when it comes to your desire to reform the European Union, the ECR group agrees with the objective, but I'm afraid the devil is in the detail. Whilst we share your commitment to strong transatlantic relations, cutting red tape to help businesses create jobs, and the need for closer security cooperation, your vision of a European Union with a bigger budget, harmonised corporate taxes, unified social policy, common asylum system, and a European Minister for Finance may be the right vision for France, but the ECR group feels it is not the right vision for all member states. And while there will be many in this chamber who see you as a saviour of the European project of political integration, many outside this chamber do not want to see an EU dominated by just one or two large member states. They want national leaders to find common solutions which are agreeable to all member states. But what you propose, Monsieur le Président, is revolutionary. But rather than sleepwalking, to use your phrase, towards your goal, it should be presented to voters across the EU with an honest disclaimer, in large letters, bold and underlined, that member states will become less and less sovereign as the EU becomes more and more sovereign, as you wish to see. And all politicians need to be careful. You talk about temporary taxes, but I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan's line that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government programme. The growing dissatisfaction amongst voters has not been because the EU has too little power, but because it has too much. And despite this power, it has failed to secure the greater stability and prosperity that was promised. Countries signed up for cooperation in key areas of mutual interest with their EU neighbours, not to see more and more decisions made in one city, the other side of the continent. Mr. Macron, we understand why you are seeking to regain the initiative. My group agrees that the European Union has drifted for far too long. But by returning to the 1950s agenda of political integration, you may be in danger of ignoring those who want an EU to face the challenges of the 2050s, not the 1950s. But we also ask for more honesty. We ask that richer Eurozone governments be honest with their voters, that their taxes will be transferred to the budgets of poorer Eurozone countries, possibly forever. For that is the way that currency and sustainable currency unions work.
In a recent television interview that you gave, you said that you have convinced President Trump that he shouldn't withdraw American troops from Syria. You've also given the order to your own military forces to take part in the Hollywood-style intervention that we've just witnessed in Syria. So, my question to you, in terms of this failed intervention that we saw last week, have you actually achieved what you wish to achieve, or actually have you managed to ignite the anger of all Arabs, in just like your intervention in Mali and elsewhere? And finally, why are you continuing talk with Turkey? That's not about excluding Turkey. You seem to be pushing them to stick to their European commitments.
Monsieur le Président.
President, if you've been able, without too much difficulty, to make us not regret your predecessor, François Hollande, and your recent decision to follow the US in a unilateral military strike in Syria, well, maybe we'll be wishing Jacques Chirac was still here, because at least he had the merits to say no to the US and their belligerents. Have you not learned anything, you and all the others, from Iraq and Libya, from these interventions that were justified at the time by moral considerations, but which ended up simply fomenting war, chaos, and allowing the jihadists to prosper? Are you not aware of that? And that in France, like Syria, it is also the worst of the Islamists who've applauded your strikes. In the international arena, like elsewhere, you're very far away from the new world that you'd like to embody. Around you, in your fortress, you have all the beneficiaries of the old world, this lost model, everyone who simply wants the status quo and yearns for the global village. Isn't that just ever less democracy? It's a Europe suffering amnesia with no borders, no identity. You like to flaunt your supposed modernity and communications for economic and environmental imperatives, for a more human world. This century will force us to come back to our limits and borders. What we need to guarantee is a sustainable France and sustainable nations in Europe. The people have spoken, Mr. President. Listen to what people are saying in the UK, Austria, Italy, Poland and Hungary. But listen to what a lot of French people are saying as well. These people want their economies, their businesses, their jobs to be protected from unfair competition. They don't want seconded workers nor free trade agreements. Only a small minority benefit from these to the detriment of the real economy and the people who are suffering. They want to put an end to this borderless immigration, endless migration. They want to reclaim their sovereignty, in other words, their freedom. Yes, people want to be able to decide for themselves. In the past, that's what we used to call democracy. People are expressing their rejection of the EU that wants to decide on everything but shows itself to be completely unable to meet the challenges that it's facing. It's all about deregulation and overregulation. Europe's absent in technology innovation, in food security, in artificial intelligence or protection of personal data. The EU, however, is omnipresent when it comes to encroaching on the freedom of nations. You want to speed ahead with nations who do not share your view and, according to what you're saying, who are laggards. But advancing to what goal? To what? More European integration, less economic regulation, more immigration and communitarisation. With you, and I'm sure you have the support of Mr. Verhofstadt, it would be Europe without Hungary but with Turkey.
President, you, as myself, want to give a future to France and Europe. It is going through a profound crisis of illegitimacy. Europe, this civilization of freedom, will be nothing tomorrow if it's allowed to be erased by demographic realities. You quoted Stefan Sniff when it came to Africa. You quoted some figures. There are 500 million citizens in Europe, 100 million on the African continent. It will be 450 million Europeans versus 2.5 billion Africans. When we look at future demographics, 3 out of 5 will be born in Africa. Your Interior Minister spoke of being submerged by migration. Immigration is bringing more dependence than active workers. It's destabilizing our societies. It's tearing our heritage that we have from centuries of struggle. What we need to do is to create more productivity. We need to have more mobility within the EU. We need to boost European birth rates. We need to digitalize our economies. We need to focus on robotics and artificial intelligence. President of the Republic, our freedoms are the product of our civilizations. It's clear what we hear from Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, Vienna. If we neglect the signals that we get from the peoples or governments of Eastern Europe, this will be very dangerous for the future of Europe. You, as President of the Republic, you have talent, you have courage. So when it comes to the fight for modernity in France, you also need to add the essential fight for the future of our civilization. The French have a lot of expectations when it comes to this, and so do many Europeans.
President of the Parliament, I'm not going to pick up on your different points chronologically, but I would like to pick up on some salient points that have been mentioned. First of all, when we talk about sovereignty and whether we're talking about nations, peoples, European peoples, I think there are a couple of clarifications I need to make. I'm surprised. I'm surprised to hear you say what you've just said. This assembly that you're meeting, you were elected to this assembly by the French people, sir. It's very strange to treat the French people in this way, disregarding that particular point.
Alors, si cette assemblée...
So this assembly, if you didn't really like it that much, perhaps you shouldn't have come. That's all.
Il fallait aller à d'autres élections.
Perhaps you should have stood as a candidate in other elections. Perhaps you should have submitted yourself to other exercises. And as for the project, the real French project here, I mean, French people chose that project in May last. You were defending your project. You lost. That project lost because the French people decided otherwise. The French people decided for this.
Mais, néanmoins...
Nevertheless, you are expressing anger here, and I've said this time and time again. We need to hear this anger, and I do hear it. I've always said that. I always have respectful debates with various people in the campaign, Madame Le Pen included, and that's why I'm afraid I cannot subscribe to this facile argument saying this is what you should do in the country, all these foolish points that I in fact addressed in my interview on Sunday last. This is the legitimacy of the French people we're talking about here, and that's why I'm here. But of course there's also all the demands coming from the French people, and therefore I simply cannot accept your view, your analysis of what is happening in my country.
And then you've asked me about Brexit, and I have a direct reply to France's position with respect to the UK and the post-Brexit situation. I'm in favour of the most integrated relations, the closest relations. And there is a solution, we're very familiar with it, and that's EU membership. It's the situation which allows perfect access to the single market, access to the freedoms, and a very good integration. Now, I know one thing, and that is we cannot promise something to the people and then claim to give them the opposite. There are going to be negotiations. Michel Barnier is conducting them under a council mandate. But I think there's one thing that's very important. I'm very fond of our friendship with the UK. We have bilateral relations in defence and management of our common borders. But there's no cherry-picking in the single market. That's a simple principle. I believe in Europe, and therefore I believe in what we've done.